Hi, my name is Alethea, and this is Sylvie. And we're here at Orkestai Farm, bringing Community Day to you. We're here with our guest, Amanda Furcall, who's going to lead us through a workshop of nature illustration. Hope you enjoy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Amanda Furcall, and we're going to talk about nature illustration. So, what are you actually going to need today to do some nature illustration? We're going to keep it very simple. All you actually need is a pencil, paper, eraser, pencil sharpener, and space to work with good light. You can basically never have too much light. If you want to be ambitious and have some additions, a magnifying glass to look closer at your subject is very helpful. Personally, I like having those gray kneaded erasers, and I'll show you why in the demonstration. Then there are different pencil hardnesses, 2H being the hardest and 6B being softer. If you don't have that, don't worry. The regular pencil you have that you use in everyday writing is a 2B. And if you have a little desk lamp to have that directional light, that can be very helpful. So a little background on me. I am the landscape ecologist at Sisters of St. Joseph in Brentwood. If you haven't been to the campus, it is gorgeous. It's over 200 acres. There's wonderful gardens and wildflower meadows and a pine barren forest, which is very special to me. It's a rare ecosystem and there are many rare plants there. So I'm very fortunate to manage such an inspiring, gorgeous place like that, and it has given me a lot of subjects for nature illustration. I found my passion for nature as a child, growing up on Long Island, exploring the beautiful ecosystems here, and I studied conservation biology to pursue that passion. So what is nature illustration? I think of it as art for the purpose of understanding nature. And that understanding can be from a scientific perspective, from a spiritual perspective, whatever way you want to look at it. For this illustration, it is a sign that is up at Shore Road Preserve in Cold Spring Harbor. And it's a small site, it's just a few acres, but there's a lot of diversity and interesting things happening there. But often I find visitors need a little help to understand what they're looking at. For example, they might look out at this grassland with little water in it, and they might not see much right away. But if they look closer, they'll see a dragonfly. If they look into the reeds, they'll see these killdeer nesting. If you glance towards the sky, you see an osprey grabbing a fish. So having this sign there, I think, helps visitors appreciate the landscape more. So why not just take a picture? Well, the benefit of doing an illustration is it helps you clarify what's there, filter out all these extraneous details, and highlight the things you want to show as the artist. So if you take a look at this image on the left, we have a photograph here of a fiddler crab. You see that big claw, but a lot of its mouth, all the features there are obscured. The rest of its legs are sort of dark and shadow, but you can see from my illustration that those features are a lot more obvious. I've repositioned that big fiddle claw a little bit so that you can see those, the mouth and the underside, which I think is an interesting part that's a little underappreciated on these crabs. They're very geometric looking. And for me, a lot of the fun of nature illustration is I really get to know these creatures better. I get to see them, study them, sit with them, and it can also be very meditative. And we have an extremely long cultural history with nature illustration, dating back to the original cave paintings. You can see all the way on the right here, this kangaroo cave painting. It's not just an outline of a kangaroo, it is actually very scientific. It's showing these different features internally, the muscles, different organ systems. And of course, we have Da Vinci famously drew all these anatomical sketches. Lewis and Clark. You may think of Lewis and Clark as explorers, and they certainly were, but they also had to be nature illustrators because they certainly didn't have camera equipment that they were lugging across the country. So anything new they saw, all the creatures they were documenting and cataloging, they had to draw them. Ernst Haeckel is one of my favorite nature illustrators. John James Audubon, incredibly famous, prolific nature illustrator, and Charles Darwin. You can see his drawings of these finch beaks here, and the little detailed differences between the shape and size of the beaks is incredibly important. And it would be pretty difficult to compare these things clearly with photographs. So how do we use nature illustration today? It's used in all different kinds of fields. Botany, medicine, anatomy. I see it all the time in trail guides and in conservation literature. We can see tiny things like cells and huge things like our solar system, seeing under the surface of our muscles and tendons. And drawing something like that really helps you have a deeper understanding of it. You remember things better when you draw them. And seeing this gorgeous painting by Stephen Nash of different monkeys and apes gives you a real appreciation for the conservation value of these species. And what we're going to do is what's often called nature journaling. And it's, like I said, used to learn about and connect with nature. It tends to be very informal, although everyone has their own style. But you can see from these examples that there's often a drawing with notes, maybe the time when you saw this, where it was, what it was doing, and having all of these together can be a really neat way to document the world around you. Whenever you're drawing something, the most important thing to do first is to really understand deeply what you're looking at. So we're going to do a quick overview of the parts of a plant since we'll be focusing on plants today. So on the left, probably all of you can identify a flower, although some of them are those little tiny flowers can be hard to see. Fruits or seed pods, you might think of them as. The main stem, leaves, noticing where the little buds come out, where the primary and then smaller secondary roots are. And you may not include roots in your plant, but they can be very interesting and you might not think of it at first. And then flower, let's bring us all back to grade school and think about the different parts of a flower. So you'll notice there are the petals, and then underneath that the usually green sepals. The female parts of the flower are called the carpel, with that stigma, the long style, and the ovary, which this is a cross section, so you will probably not see that unless you do use some kind of knife and slice your plant open. And then there's the male part, the stamen, which includes the anther with that top with the pollen on it, and then the long filament that comes down from there. And then the identifying features of plants. Something that people often don't notice is the type of leaf. We're all so enamored with the flowers that we sometimes forget, so I wanted to take a minute to go over the different types and arrangements of leaves. So there's simple leaves, which is sort of one chunk of leaf. You can see that example on the bottom there. And then there's compound leaves, where they're separated out into sections. And simple leaves can be entire or lobed. So, for example, a maple leaf is lobed and a beech leaf is entire. And sometimes having the words for these can really help you remember what you're looking for. Having that word attached to it can help you see it a little more clearly. So once you figure out if you have simple or compound leaves, you would probably look at, are they opposite, alternate, whorled, basal? So opposite leaves, you can see there's one central branch there. One leaf comes off to the left, one leaf comes off to the right. They're opposite along the stem. And contrary to that would be alternate. They're alternating along the stem. All basal leaves just means all the leaves are coming out from the very bottom of the plant and you don't have any leaves coming up along the stem. Whorled leaves are not as common, but they're very beautiful. Their leaves are coming out from one point along the stem. So you have one point and a few leaves coming off of that, and then up a few inches and another point and leaves coming off of that central point. And then looking in close at the margin of a leaf, which is what the term we use for the edge of the leaf, the margin, you can see if it's toothed or not. And there are all different kinds of naming conventions for the toothing. But the most important thing is to look at it and trust your eye and look at those shapes. Similarly, there are a myriad of flower shapes. We may, when we're sort of just doodling flowers, draw those stellate flowers, or what they call the rotate wheel-like flowers. But you might also find flowers that are this bell shape or funnel shape. So identifying what kind of shape you have here can be really important as you start looking at the plant you have. So what's the process? As I mentioned, getting to know your subject is the first thing you do, and it's actually the most important. That's when you're going to use that magnifying glass if you have it, and if you don't, no worries, just bring it up close to your face, take a really good look, take time to get to know your subject. Why were you interested in it to begin with? What made you pick it up? And then second is set the viewing angle. I think a lot of people don't realize how important this is. You really have to set it out in front of you after you've taken a good long time to look at it and decide how you're going to show it. So you can see with this drawing on the right, I have the little roots and tubers, and then the leaves arching up and to the left. And you have to, as the artist, sit back and make sure your eye is always looking at your subject from the same angle, or else your perspective is going to be off. And then the outline. And I've specifically written gentle outline because we all want to start with those bold lines, and we have to try hard not to, because the best thing you can do is make nice light lines you can always erase later. And then steps 4 and 5 are really optional. A lot of nature illustration, a lot of nature journaling is just simple outlines, maybe a couple little details. But I would say the most important thing is just having that nice outline and focus on that. Make sure each step is done before you jump to the next. But we will talk a little bit about shading and then adding in those finishing details. And my last point on this is art is not created with your hand. It's created with your eye. So with the exception of some of us who maybe have slightly shaky hands, your hand, if it pretty much does what you're asking it to do, somebody who's quote-unquote good at drawing, it's not that their hand is better at drawing something than yours is. It's that they're looking at it differently. So we're going to try to get those artist eyes in the workshop today. Now, here's where the fun part really starts. Go out, find your subject. It can be anything at all. in the natural world. It can be small, it can be relatively large. Just make sure you can manipulate it and it fits on your table in your workspace. And I will meet you back at the farm and we can start drawing.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining me here at Orkestai Farm for the demonstration part of our workshop. Before we start drawing your subject, I want to go over a few basic tips on drawing plants. Now, they'll relate to any subject you have, but plants are a pretty good subject because they don't tend to move around on us too much, even though it is a bit of a windy day here, so we'll see what we get. But for now, let's just zoom in and take a look at what I have on my paper.
All right, so my first example, I drew this flower starting with a circle that you can see here in red. Then I marked the center point. Even though this flower has what's called a disc here, I marked the centermost point because we want each petal to point to that center, not the edge of the disc. I drew vertical and horizontal guides, and I also drew the adjacent angles for reference, since this flower has a lot of petals. Then I sketched the petals in the same order that I drew the guides to get a nice even flower. So that's not too bad. But when we get into perspective, people get nervous. So I'll show you the basics. There's some subtle but important changes. If you take this flower and instead of looking at it head on, you're looking at it at a bit of an angle, where the back of the flower is tilting away from you. You get foreshortening. The back petals look smaller and the front ones look larger. So instead of drawing a circle, I drew an oval. I still marked my center point of the flower, but you'll notice it's a little bit higher than the center of the oval. I drew the disc and again marked the horizontal and vertical edges and then drew the petals in that order. You want to make sure you have these petals going out to the points you marked so that you don't get fat petals clustering together. Then leaves. Whenever you have a bending leaf, it can be confusing to figure out how that translates to two dimensions. So I have two examples here. You may be able to see a little bit better on number 4. What you do is you start with the midline, called the midrib of the leaf, and you draw it in one big arch. Then you draw the top line of the leaf and the bottom line. So you actually draw all 3 lines, then you erase the parts you can't see. Often, people will try to draw it in disconnected segments and it never comes out looking quite right. You have to make sure that all of the lines connect in the background. In figure 5 here, I have a bell-shaped flower. Think about what shape the flower you're looking at actually is. So in this case, I drew a circle here and another one down here and connected the edges there. There's a midline, and again, I drew the front petals first and the back petals afterward. Here we have a pomate leaf, and it's called that because the sections and veins of the leaves fan out from the stem like the fingers from your palm. Overall, there's a circle here, so I drew that circle first. I drew my center point, and then I actually drew the mid veins and the stem. Then I drew a lobe around each vein, creating the leaflets. Number 7 here is a tube-shaped flower. And again, you just want to make sure that behind these petals, the tube of the flower connects to the stem. And pine cones. Here's a great example of a natural object you might find with a distinct pattern. This particular giant sequoia cone has a more closed, tight shape than many other cones, and so it's a great example to show what that pattern is. These seed scales grow out in a spiral, and they form an angled grid. So I drew the oval first, I drew my angled grid, and then I simply filled in the details of each scale. And finally, I have a 5-petaled flower here. Again, it's basically circular. I made the midpoint, and then instead of drawing the vertical and horizontal lines, I drew guides for where the separation of the petals is. That helped me get it a little more even. You can see I included part of the branch and leaves. I made sure that behind the scenes the leaf connected to the branch, as it did in real life. Now that you've learned some basics of finding the patterns in natural objects and how to work with perspective, we're going to start our own drawings. So take your subject, set it out in front of you, and let's get to work. So I found my subject. This plant I happen to know is Lesser celandine. It's invasive, so I didn't feel bad about pulling it up from the farm. Identification can be a really great first step to learning about your subject, and iNaturalist is a great app for that. Take a close look at your own subject as I use this washi tape to hold my subject in place. Look really close, notice the details. For me, I love the leaves of this plant. They're glossy, they have spidery veins, and a dark, almost purple coloring around the mid-veins. They also bloom very early, and being one of the first flowers we see, they tend to catch my eye. Set up your subject, figure out what features you'd like to highlight. How you arrange it is critical, so think about what drew you to this subject in the first place. Make sure you can see those features. If you're not sure where to begin, I would suggest less is more. Start with something simple. I had a big plant here and I narrowed it down to a couple of leaves and one flower. But you can start even simpler than that. Start with one leaf and really focus on the detail in it. As you can see, I'm using a picture frame as a background. Having a solid white background can be very helpful. Try to imagine a frame in your mind. I'm going to imagine a frame that's smaller than the actual frame I have here. That imaginary frame will help you arrange things on your paper. You want to fill the space on the page. So I'm going to pick up my 2B pencil. You can see I have a number of pencils here of different hardnesses, and your regular quote-unquote number 2 pencil would be considered an HB hardness. So between the harder H's and softer B's. And that's perfectly fine, but I prefer to start with a slightly softer 2B. I'm looking for symmetry here and patterns, and I have symmetrical leaves with veins sort of spidering out from the mid-vein. Remember to draw lightly and keep your head in the same position. Sit back, sit up tall if you can. I know many of us are hunched over our computers a lot these days, so it's nice to have an opportunity to go outside and do some relaxing drawing. So instead of drawing one hard line, I'm making many light lines. Remember to stop and look up periodically, see if things are lining up the way they do in real life. I can see from my angle, this flower has a little foreshortening. It's facing to my left. And the stem comes out at the back between the other stems for a moment and then behind. Remember to look at your negative space. That's your space between things. So the top leaf, from my perspective, comes down, and there's just that much space between the two leaves. And then there's a sort of triangle between this leaf and that leaf's stem. Don't worry if it's not perfect. The leaves aren't perfect. Just get some basic lines down. If you need to make long sweeping lines, sometimes turning your paper helps. Then I'm going to start erasing some of my extraneous lines. I have this kneaded eraser. This is great because you can shape it however you want. So I can make a point and come in and erase. You can also use it to lift. So if my line is a little dark here, I can just press down and pick up some of the graphite. I had that leaf line coming down here, but the flower is in front, so I can erase that now. But if I change anything later, I'd want to check that spacing again. Always trust your eye. Look at your subject as much as possible. And if you can keep your eyes on the subject and not on your paper, all the better. I'm just finalizing my outline. So normally I'd sit here a little longer and fiddle with it, but this is meant to be a more relaxed nature journaling exercise, and in this class we're trying to just get the fundamentals and enjoy ourselves. Try not to stay on one area for too long. You don't want to get a bunch of detail in one spot and then find you have to change it. And I can see I haven't drawn this mid-vein quite right. It should be pointing to the tip of the leaf. The vein itself doesn't go to the tip, So when I draw it, I'll just make a gesture with my hand as if I were going to draw the whole thing, and then lift my pencil off the paper at the very end. Think about the gesture that the leaves or plants are making. And there's actually a whole kind of drawing called gestural drawing, where you do these fluid outlines and get the movement of the subject. So I'm ready to work on the flower. I have the center there. I can see the petals point out in 8 directions. And I'm going to draw this one based on the midline of each petal. So I'll mark those and then draw each petal around its midline. I'm watching my negative space because particularly on this flower, the petals are not sitting equidistant from each other, and some of them are folding forward towards me. Your subject may shift a bit as mine is doing in this wind, but try to keep your mental image of the original positioning in your head and just do your best. Then I'm using a smudger, which is really just a rolled up piece of paper to smooth out the lines. You can do this with a balled up piece of paper towel, but make sure not to use your fingers because the oils will smudge your drawing. Use the kneaded eraser again and make a point with it and use it to lift the graphite and give us those highlights. Shading is the next step, but before I start that, I want to show you a few different shading techniques. The first is hatching. You just do that, parallel lines. You can make it softer or darker. You can have sharper lines or have them blend into each other. Then cross-hatching is just hatching with another hatch over it. Especially for natural things, you want to try to have them not at 90-degree angles from each other. A sharper angle will look more natural than having that hard 90-degree box. Then there's stippling. You just make lots of little dots. This works well with markers. It takes a long time, but you can get a really beautiful, soft finish with it. And you can see it gives you a very different texture than the hatching. Finally, there's scumble, which is also called random mark. What I do for this is make one curling continuous line arching over itself in an irregular way. Think about where your light is. Traditionally, the light would be coming from the top left. And you'll see that in a lot of Western art because Western languages are read from top left. So we naturally, quote unquote, read a painting that way as well. Since I have a lot of diffuse light outside today, I don't have many shadows. I have a little one here where the stem is obscured by the leaf. A couple more here and there. And if in your shading you can follow the angle of your subject, that will really help it pop. And so keep filling in details. Take time with your subject. And when you feel like you're about done, maybe write down some notes about it, where you found it, anything you noticed about your subject and want to record in your journal. And I really encourage you to keep doing this. You can find any little bit of nature in your yard, on your front steps, walking down the sidewalk. And many of us have some extra free time right now. This can be a really great, calming, meditative way to get closer to nature. So thanks for joining me, and keep on drawing.